Ask you a couple questions about classmates today. Yeah, what's up? So I'm already like convinced it's late, so I can't write for it. Can I just take time to revise it then today and turn it in later today again?
If you would like, yeah, because that's just, within the 24-hour
Yeah.
period, so that'd just be one day, it's 5%. So if you feel like you have a better paper, in
Yeah,
that window, yeah, and that's
I'll probably do that and then can we skip? I mean,
if you're not feeling well or you need
Yeah.
a class, you're going
I just wanted to ask because we have 3 unexcused absences for this class.
Yep.
I wasn't registered for the class for the first 2 days. Do those count for you?
I did not take attendance for the week because we're adding dropping all of that. So that's
Sounds
not
perfect.
counted. Yeah,
Okay.
it happens. Everybody gets 3 and, recordings and slides will be up after.
Yeah, I need an idea of today, so I'll
I
talk to you.
understand.
See you today.
Thank you. Right. Let's go ahead and get started today. Good morning and welcome back. Hope you all had a great weekend and are enjoying the warmer, more pleasant weather. We are getting into the last 4 full weeks of the term. I'd imagine some of you who are burning the midnight oil on your application paper are a little bit worn out from that experience. So thank you for getting that in. And I'm looking forward to reading those. If you turned that in yesterday, you should expect feedback from me on your grade on that assignment by the end of this week. So thank you for getting that in. Just as we're looking ahead and thinking about the next assignments in the course, the second application paper, which is structured just like this one, will be due on June 4th. So for the second application paper, I'm asking you to pick one of the theories that we've talked about in the second half of the course. So we've gone over a couple of them already, including rhetoric and dramatism. We'll be going over narrative paradigm today, but you get to pick a different artifact to apply to that theory and explain some key ideas and findings. And once you complete both of the application papers, you get to choose one to revise for your final paper in the course. So just want to put that on your radar. That is coming up in the next few weeks. So thank you for all of your work on getting that going. So we had an attendance optional workshop day last Friday, but our last in-class content day was yet last Wednesday. So last Wednesday, we talked about dramatism. Dramatism being a way of making sense of and understanding rhetoric, public communication, as if it's a stage, right? All the world's a stage, we're merely players. And we use dramatism to understand how it might make sense of the different elements of communication that might be used in various artifacts. So one key idea here from dramatism was Burke's notion of blank, which was used to identify key parts of a communication situation. 5 main parts. Anyone want to take a stab at what this is? Yes. Yeah, so thanks, Jack. So Burke's pentad, right? The pentad goes over the different elements, including the agent, agency, scene, purpose, and so on. It's laying out the who, what, and when, and where of the communication situation that you're choosing to analyze or study, right? So for instance, if you were analyzing a public address like a State of the Union, right? What is the purpose? What is the goal? What is the scene or context that that speaker or presenter is using to set up that communication? So dramatism is great as a possible artifact to analyze public or rhetorical styles of communication. For today, we are wrapping up our trio of more rhetoric-oriented theories by talking about the narrative paradigm. The narrative paradigm is a really useful theory to understand and to make sense of storytelling and the use of storytelling as a means of persuasion in our own communication and relationships. So we'll be talking about applying elements of the narrative paradigm, and we'll also be having a group discussion a little bit later. And today we have class presentations. We've got 2 from Lindsay and Austin. I've got both of your slides and material pulled up, so we'll have you all share your presentations in just a little bit. Any questions about anything we've talked about so far in the course? Anything related to application papers or anything else before we get started? So the application paper, again, as mentioned, is going to be drawing upon some similar elements as the first paper. The rubric and available theories, like last time, are available for you to access on campus. So today, we are looking at the narrative paradigm, and any class that's an excuse for me to talk about Star Trek is a good one. I'm always excited to use that as an example of a theory. So the narrative paradigm is in many ways concerned about the use of storytelling as a means of persuasion and convincing each other to adopt different perspectives and beliefs. Just last weekend, I watched A Man Called Otto, which recently came on Netflix. It's a really good example about how cultural values and beliefs, such as providing support, respect for neighbors, lending people tools, resources, all of those things fit within a broader narrative paradigm of how we treat other people and behave as a community. So there's a lot of examples in media here of how these theories are at play in our lives. We're storytellers, right? We use persuasion as a means of telling stories and sharing experiences that ground our understanding of the world. If you think back to when you were a little kid, right? Or if you are regularly, working with, spending time with, or babysitting kids, you are likely familiar with the usage of various myths and stories, right? For example, the tortoise and the hare, Goldilocks and Three Bears, right? A lot of these types of stories, Aesop's fables that have some type of moral or message are designed to convey values, beliefs, and perspectives among children. How should we behave? Should we be honest? Slow and steady wins the race, right? That use of morals and storytelling in many ways serves as a cultural guiding framework. We see this across a lot of different cultures and situations, as we'll be getting to. So this comes from a rhetorical tradition, trying to understand the available means of persuasion, how we use persuasion to influence one another. Comes in a public and relational context, understanding how we engage publicly in the collective unconscious through the use of stories. For example, Carl Jung's work on the collective unconscious, the idea that we have shared human experiences and stories that are conveyed with one another is closely connected to this theory. And like other theories we've been getting at recently, this is a more interpretive and hermeneutic approach. So the application that we'll be looking at in just a little bit is an episode from the television show Star Trek: The Next Generation called Darmok, picture here on the right. He is a member of an alien species that can only speak in metaphors and speaks through the use of storytelling. In the entire episode, the goal is for Captain Picard here on the left to try to understand and communicate with Darmok, understanding that he is only able to speak in metaphors and that the use of storytelling grounds his experiences and ways that he looks at the world. So the entire episode is using communication as a means of bridging gaps and understanding people across different cultures. So the narrative paradigm comes from Walter Fisher. Late Walter Fisher is pictured here, professor emeritus at the Annenberg School for Communication. Fisher is particularly notable because he's somebody who came in communication studies, essentially applying and utilizing Kenneth Burke's work. We talked a bit about Burke last class, a bit of an interesting character, not really tied to a particular discipline or department, but a lot of communication scholars have used and applied his work, including Fisher, to understand how rhetoric can be utilized as a tool of narrative storytelling and persuasion. So, according to Walter Fisher, we have the core idea of a paradigm, right? A paradigm is what's considered to be how people think about words and their meaning. That is, knowledge must always be knowledge from a certain position, will come from their lived experiences and perspectives as a way of foregrounding their knowledge of topic. We think back to Piraha, indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest, right? Do not have words to describe numbers past 3, so their perspective and way of viewing the world, there's 1 stick, 2 stick, 3 stick, or many sticks, shapes their understanding of events. So there's what's known as the rational world paradigm, right? This goes back to the Sophists, this goes back to Aristotle. The idea that we should only have logos and logic governing our thoughts, right? The logical perspective wins over. Spock in Star Trek series, half Vulcan, a species that believes that logic should govern our decision making over the use of human emotions. That's something the narrative paradigm is critiquing, right? We're not robots, we're not automatons, we're not just logically oriented people. Instead, we're human beings. We're influenced, we're moved by the stories and the experiences that we hear in our lives. For a lot of you, for example, if you're flipping channels or you're streaming and you see an ad like a sad commercial encouraging you to adopt a pet through the SPCA, it's using that appeal to pity and appeal to human emotions. And that's an element that shapes our persuasion. We get angry, we get frustrated, we get concerned, we get anxious, and that human emotion is guiding much of how we're persuaded about issues. And as a result of that form of persuasion, we have what's known as mythos, the usage of storytelling and narrative that's being suggested by Fisher here as an alternative to logos and the use of logic to frame human experiences. That we're guided by stories and stories that make sense to us, right? Our lives can be understood as a narrative or use storytelling to make sense of and guide our experiences. One example is whether or not you believe everything happens for a reason, right? It's using a mental framework as a way of trying to contextualize and broadly explain our human experiences. So, pictured here on the right is an example here of the Lakota indigenous people who develop a creation story, right? The use again of storytelling. Under Lakota storytelling and myth, it's the idea that the sun and moon, right, are lovers, they're romantic partners who together through their union created the universe and those who live on it, right? So this is a story, the use of storytelling, the use of storytelling as it connects to religious and spiritual experiences is seen across a variety of cultures and contexts. So as a result of us being natural storytellers, of using storytelling to share and talk to each other, right? We look at and we assess the stories that people tell each other about each other. For example, I always love this story about my dad. So my dad always loved to fish. My dad also loved to tie flies that you could use as a lure when you were going fishing. And my dad was always like embarrassed or anxious about using his own flies when he went fishing. For whatever reason, he liked making flies, but he didn't like using his own flies. So he had a good friend named Randy, and suddenly they were both fishing together, and Randy started catching all sorts of fish. And my dad asked, well, how did you catch those fish? How did you do that? What's your secret? And Randy kind of looked at him and smiled and said, well, I was using your flies. So stories like that, right, where it's kind of this message about my dad was very kind of humble. He was embarrassed. He wasn't sure if, his flies weren't going to work, but they did with the help of a friend. That helps kind of shape the way that I remember and think about him. And I'd imagine as you think about family members, relatives, close friends, you probably have a lot of stories too that help you to understand and summarize that person and how you think about that person. And in that way, we're using and assessing stories, right? We're developing good reasons. That is, do we assess that that story is correct or true? History, biography, culture, and character are ways that we assess the story. Does it make sense from what we know about history, from what we know about this person? Does it make sense in the context of our lived experiences, right? Oftentimes we hear tall tales, stories that are not necessarily true, that are distorted, that are incorrect. If you've been following anything with the recent member of Congress, George Santos, and all of that discussion about material that he suggested was part of his resume and background that is not correct, this is a debate we have to this day about the rationality and correctness of stories. So rationality is the consistency and truthfulness of a story, right? And it can be one or the other, or both. So a story could be consistent, but not true. It makes sense, it connects, right? But it's based off of a lie. So a lot of these kinds of stories are creating a more elaborate tale to explain experiences. Again, a lot of superhero films do this. And truthfulness, is this correct? Sometimes a story can be truthful, but not consistent. It's correct, but the way that the story is being told is kind of fragmented or jumbled, and it doesn't persuade people. We experience the world as filled with stories, and we need to decide among them, right? So we experience stories, we're reading news headlines, we're accessing information, right? If we are hearing a story and it's coming from a particular political or social slant, there's a lot of elements of our own culture, identity, and experience that are going to shape which of those stories makes sense to us. How do we interpret this experience or event that's happened, right? Again, a really good example of this, which again makes me feel old, since you all, many of you were born after this date, is 9/11. What do we make of that story? What do we make of that experience? How do we remember that historical event? How does that shape future action? As a means of addressing and thinking about storytelling, we have to consider narration and the use of narratives to shape our lived experience. One really common example here is if you think about Isaac Newton. A lot of you might think about the story that, an apple fell on Isaac Newton's head while he was sitting under a tree. And through that process, he developed and created an understanding of gravity as we know it, right? Developed that as a theory to understand the world. In actuality, as we know from historical context, the apple didn't actually fall on Newton's head, but instead, over time, the story's been embellished, it's been changed, and the actual event depicts it as falling on his head. So there are ways in which the narrative through kind of cultural telephone changes over time. So narrative rationality is judging how we're using narratives and sharing narratives as a way of making sense. We're using both coherence and fidelity to assess the narratives that we hear in our lives. Coherence is the idea of internal consistency. In other words, within the narrative itself, does it make sense, right? In other words, does the story flow smoothly? Does it have a beginning, a middle, an end point? Are you able to follow along? If you know any friends, family members, relatives who are really good storytellers, they're people who really think about the coherence. They've told the story before, and you can really follow along and understand what's going on. So you also have to consider the material, right? Is it similar to other stories that you've heard? Does it make sense that this story aligns with how they have told the story in the past? And lastly, there's what's considered to be categorical or characterological coherence. In other words, do we believe the characters in the story? Do we believe that the things that they said or did are correct? Again, my dad loved to go fishing, and he loved to say that, he caught a fish that was a lot bigger than what it actually was, right? I checked in with his friend Randy, and he said, oh, they were like tiny, So oftentimes, we're assessing the story to see if it's correct relative to our understanding of that person and of their experience. So ethos, as we've talked about before, matters in how we shape and understand storytelling too. And then secondarily, we have to consider fidelity, right? Fidelity is about the truthfulness or reliability of the story. So we ask ourselves, does the story seem correct? Does the story seem relevant to our lives? And again, in terms of a lot of social, political, cultural beliefs, if a story is lining up with our own experience and interpretation of events, that's something that we are more likely to interpret as a correct or true story for lived experiences. So we look at stories, we hear stories, stories are circulated and used in our lives, and we're taking the time to assess and break down stories based on coherence and fidelity to make an overall statement about the rationality of those stories, right? And again, this theory is bringing in an assumption that we as human beings are able to judge and make sense of and evaluate stories in a critical way. If you're a young child, right, and you're hearing the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, maybe you're a little bit anxious to go out in the woods because you think it's a true story and, the bears might actually have a house. So, there are a few assumptions here about our ability to address and respond to the stories that we hear in our lives. Which brings us to some of the critiques of this theory. So one of the critiques here is that the narrative paradigm is very broad, right? Similar to a couple other rhetorical theories we've talked about, the idea that a lot of persuasion can be broken down into the use of storytelling. Well, there's a lot of other ways that we're persuaded and convinced in everyday life. For example, we're exposed to headlines, we're exposed to arguments, we're exposed to logical appeals that might exist outside of a story with characters, plot, setting, etc. Secondarily, right, we have to consider whose story is being told, what stories are being included and situated, right? So, for instance, we think about the sort of dominance of Western culture, right, in terms of our understanding of storytelling, narratives, and experience. A lot of the use of stories, such as indigenous creation stories, is not necessarily shared, taught, or understood in the same capacity. So if we're looking at how stories are developed, circulated, shared, and utilized in our lives, we have to ask ourselves, what role might media have in shaping the stories that we are exposed to? What role does culture, value, and identity play in how we're understanding lived experience and so on, right? If you've been following a lot of political and cultural discourse, we know that there's a lot of debate about children's literature, books, right? Books that might be inclusive and supportive of lived experiences of LGBTQ+ people, right? And having stories that include those experiences and educate children on those experiences. A lot of folks who believe that inclusion of that material is appropriate, it helps children, and critique and push back against that material not being age appropriate. So we're seeing a lot of debate and discussion here about how this information is being included and told to people. And if we think back to Burke and dramatism, we know a crucial element of persuasion is identification, finding similarities between ourselves and the person who's persuading us. So there's other elements here, right, that might be at play. Again, thinking about ethos and credibility, thinking about logos and the use of logical argumentation. Sometimes when you're persuaded and convinced by things that don't involve the use of a direct story. So there's some critiques here, but overall, narrative paradigm is really useful when we're trying to understand how a particular story is being used, presented, and circulated to reach its audience. So that being said, we've got two presentations today. We've got Lindsay and Austin. So we'll kind of go in order. So I believe, Lindsay, this one is yours, correct? Great. And you've got 6 to 8 minutes. I'll let you know when you have 4, 3, 2, 1. And then you are welcome to either click or use the arrow keys as you're working between slides. Give me just a moment to set up my timer. All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so the article that I found was titled "The Use of Narrative Paradigm Theory in Assessing Audience Value Conflict in Image Advertising." So pretty much just advertising in general for businesses. So some key ideas that I took from this article was that businesses use stories to encourage loyalty. Loyalty creates productivity, sells products, holds equity, and maintains public relations. The value of loyalty makes businesses invest in creating stories in the advertisement and public relations. And then this article did an analysis and a study on an Exxon commercial, which, if you don't know what Exxon is, it's a gas station pretty much. And this commercial is a little over a minute and jumps around to different people driving on the road and what their thoughts are. So it uses no talking, it's just music, and it just jumps between pictures of people in the car. So passengers, it can be dogs, kids, people driving, and then it just shows their thoughts. Some of the thoughts, for example, are, "Why can't I drive?" coming from a kid, or "This lady needs to walk me," coming from the dog, and "Turn off your blinker" from a man driving. So just their thoughts in general. So the commercial makes you have to read their thoughts. And then the analysis found that the images were basic and understandable, which relates to people who live comfortable and still have ambition. And then the analysis also found that the audience had troubles differentiating between what they know for certain and what the business wants them to know. And then it also, the analysis also goes over to rationality and the value-latedness of the information being given. And then it also goes over the effects on modern and postmodern culture. So some of the connections to narrative paradigm is that the narrative paradigm theory uses a two-pronged approach, which may offer useful assessment tools for predicting long-term success, believability, and saliency of an image advertising. The two prongs are rational and value-latedness, like I said. In the commercial, to highlight rational, the commercial uses logical arguments and evidence to support their message. They use scientific facts about the environmental impact. It shows that the business is addressing the problem of climate change and taking progressive steps towards that. And then for the value-latedness, it portrays Exxon as a company that cares about the well-being of humans and the planet. Emotional storytelling, they use the emotional storytelling that connects to a vast amount of people. By using emotional storytelling, the business can connect to more individuals to invoke empathy and sense of shared values. And then some other connections was the reliance of interpretation makes assessing the advertisement prior to distribution important. This narrative paradigm gives businesses the tools to identify the rational and value-oriented perceptions. This also allows businesses to convey their message effectively to a wide range of people. It's important for businesses to do this. So to have a assessment before they distribute their information in order to get feedback. And then some things that I learned from this article is that corporations can no longer rely solely on product advertisements aimed at mass audiences that make claims based on rational arguments. They need value. A good image advertisement reaches the core of shared existences and allows businesses to express themselves. And then a mix of both rational and value-laden information reaches a wider audience. The narrative paradigm can identify potential sources of audience conflict by eliminating sources of disbelief arising from values and life experiences that contradict the business's message. Stories that have a stronger persuasion and touch more people when they have both coherence and fidelity, like we just talked about in the class. So yeah, that's what I learned, and then that is my work side.
Lindsay, thanks so much for sharing. So I'll make a couple notes as I'm pulling up Austin's. So I think this does a really great job of combining a couple of the things that we've been talking about so far, right? So we've talked a lot about organizational oriented theories, kind of looking at business and management side, and then also looking at the public rhetorical side. And the use of storytelling is something we see in advertising, including image advertising all the time, right? If you're looking at a commercial for something like a medication or product, what do you see? Well, oftentimes there's somebody who's sad, who's down, who is dealing with some type of condition. They're taking the medication and they're feeling better. There's an ad for an antidepressant that was literally a cloud over somebody's head that gets lifted when they start taking the medication. So there's a lot of strategies that businesses are using, telling stories, sharing experiences as a means of getting us engaged. A lot of very kind of prominent figures in advertising. We think about the Geico lizard. We think about Flo from Progressive. A lot of these characters are used in kind of scenarios and stories as a way of making these advertisements persuasive and memorable to us, right? Situating those characters is part of the broader argument. So a lot of these are really good ways to think about how the narrative paradigm can be used, applied, and contextualized to different settings. And I appreciated Lindsay's work in bringing that organizational element in and understanding and assessing how companies and businesses can use the narrative paradigm in their own professional work. Okay, so Austin, we'll have you up next. So download it as a PDF. So you're welcome to click as you're going through the slides here. All right, so it should show displayed pretty well for you there. Great.
So the article I chose to look at was how do users adopt health information from social media, a narrative paradigm perspective. Before we get into the details of the article, it shows that social media has a large amount of influence over the way people around the world obtain and share information. The article stresses that information shared and obtained through social media can be very misleading and unreliable. And the main reason for this poor quality information, because any user, unidentified or without clinical credentials, can upload misleading content. In the article, the researchers were interested in the effects of narrative coherence and narrative fidelity on the user's intentions to adopt social media health information. Like we talked about earlier, coherence is determining whether or not a story makes sense structurally. Basically, can the reader or listener make sense of the story? And narrative fidelity is determining whether you believe a story is true based on your own experiences. And then information adoption was defined in the study as accepting the information as truth and abiding by the information in the future. The researchers' first hypothesis was that narrative coherence will positively be associated with the intention to adopt social media health information. Second, that fidelity is positively associated with the intention to adopt social media health information. The third, that the higher the social economic status someone has, the higher the positive effect of coherence will have on their intention to adopt social media health information. And then lastly, the higher the socioeconomic status someone has, the higher the positive effect of fidelity will be on their intention to adopt social media health information. So the researchers opened an online questionnaire to be completed by volunteers in a health forum based in China. They received 257 valid submissions for the study. In these questionnaires, participants were asked to recall a recent health-related message they received from a friend. Based on the perceptions of that message, each subject was asked to answer some questions regarding coherence, fidelity, and their intention to adopt that information. Their demographic and annual income information were also collected in these surveys. The researchers analyzed the responses provided by the participants by using tests that include composite reliability, average variance extracted, and Cronbach's alpha. These tests accounted for the age, gender, marital status, internet experience, online health experience, perceived susceptibility, and dispositional trust, along with their interpretations about coherence, fidelity, and intentions to adopt information. So along with analyzing the participants' demographic information, fidelity, coherence, and intentions to adopt information, they observed how their socioeconomic status played into these other variables. They determined that coherence did not have significant effect on their intentions to adopt information, which did not support hypothesis 1. They also determined that fidelity had a significant impact on their intentions to adopt information, and that supported hypothesis 2. People that had low socioeconomic statuses, it showed that narrative coherence had no significant impact on their intentions to adopt information. And people with high socioeconomic statuses, it showed that their narrative coherence had a significant impact on the intention to adopt information. And as for fidelity, if someone had a low socioeconomic status, their fidelity did not have a significant impact on their information adaptation. And then if they had a high socioeconomic status, their fidelity did not have, or did have a significant impact on their intentions to adopt information. So the narrative paradigm suggests that we choose what we want to believe. And the study further proves that theory by showing a positive relationship between fidelity and someone's intention to adopt health information. So basically, when someone hears a story on social media or information about health, it falls in line with what they already know, they are more likely to adopt that information, especially from people with higher socioeconomic statuses. And overall, the results of the study suggest that providing a good story when communicating health information on social media can be more convincing than providing logical or scientific arguments. And those are my.
All right, so Austin, thanks so much for sharing this article as well. I think these coming from very different kind of subfields and areas show us the ways that the narrative paradigm is being used very broadly in communication. So if we're looking at this example, right, I think this points to the ways, as we've talked about, that theories change, they develop, they're modified, they're adjusted, and sometimes the assumptions a theory brings don't end up holding water in scenarios. So while Fisher proposes that both coherence and fidelity are really important, right? As Austin brings up, it was fidelity that was seen as statistically significant, not coherence, which tells us, as Austin brought up, that if a story is something we see as truthful and circulating about health information, we're more likely to take in that information, even if it's not presented in the most coherent or organized way. On the flip side, if we don't buy or believe the story, even if the story is presented in a compelling way, the study suggests we're less likely to take that on too. So as we're thinking about myths and disinformation as it circulates online, including about health, I think understanding that we're assessing truthfulness and considering how the truth or assigned truth value we give to that information gets used in our lives is a really useful addition here that helps us understand how the narrative paradigm is fitting into our experiences more. So I appreciate you both in bringing some really varied and engaging examples here of this theory in action and explaining the power of stories and storytelling in our lived experiences. So thank you both. So I want to share a short clip from the Star Trek Next Generation episode. Again, Captain Picard is here on the left. He's working with the alien here on the right. While they have a universal transmitter, this alien speaks in metaphor and uses storytelling as a means of communicating and conveying reality, right? So the entire conflict of the episode is Picard trying to understand what the heck he's talking about and how this story can be used as a means of understanding and dealing with the alien threat that they're both encountering. So as you're watching this short clip, pay attention to how narratives and storytelling are being used here as a means of Darmok species conveying reality and sharing information with one another.
It's a blacksmith. A similar situation to the one we're facing here. His army with fists open. A strategy with fist open. With fist open. His army with fists closed. With fists closed. An army with fists open. We've got the enemy with is closed to attack. Example. This. His eyes are covered.
So got the 2000s era CGI alien, hooray. So a good example here, right, of not only this like story using past experience, talking about arms open, strategizing, arms closed versus going to battle, talking about his eyes widen, right, understanding. Picard understands how to communicate, right? So using these metaphors and using these stories as a means of communication, a very kind of direct and on the nose example, but a broader way that we make sense of our reality through the use of stories, pass down and share those stories with one another. So I think kind of a cool example here. Again, I love the way sci-fi plays with human concepts and ideas and puts them in interesting ways. Film Arrival, that we'll be talking about later in the class, does a really good job of situating this here. So for our group attendance activity for today, in the remaining about 10 minutes or so that we have, we've had the chance to talk about the rhetoric, dramatism, and narrative paradigm over the last few class meetings. Take some time to discuss, have one person write or type. What are some of the similarities and differences that you see? What's an example in each group of a narrative that you're seeing as a persuasive argument? How are narratives being used in your lives? And then lastly, especially in light of what we heard from Austin, in your perspective, is coherence or fidelity more important? Why do you feel like one of those two might be more important for how we make sense of and use stories? So let's do some larger groups for today. We'll do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 over here with these rows. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the middle here. And then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 over here on this side. So take some time to move into your groups. Again, have a person to write or type. discuss and share some of your notes in your group. And we'll meet together to talk about some of these ideas in just a little bit. Considering audience, the role of audience. Really breathing and how do we fight? It's like an intentional effort in the narrative paradigm that you are the person telling the story for a reason versus an actor on the stage who's just there regardless of what your intention is to persuade. If your groups are shifting to number 2, you might share what are stories, tales that have been told to you commonly that have shaped your understanding of the world. The story of haunted doors is a really great example here. Yeah.
It was.
An urban myth. Yeah. Rural myth, I suppose.
I'm serious.
So take about 3 more minutes. Sounds like groups are kind of wrapping up part 2. So of these 2, coherence or fidelity, which is making the more sense to their audience. You don't trust you. What do you, I'm not gonna listen to what you have to say, but.
Yeah, actually. Understanding something.
Just take a minute to finish your discussion and have one person who's available to share.
Yeah.
Sounds like groups are just about done here. So let's chat about this together, and I'm going to work through each group and have each group address one of the responses. So let's start with the group here on this side. What was your answer here to number one? What do you see as some of the similarities and differences in these different theories?
So we said rhetoric, Jonathan, the paradigm is similar and that they all contain a speaker instead, so we're going to have some sort of actions from audience. They're different because in the use of narrative paradigm, it's more of an intentional effort to tell a story, whereas in dramaticism, it's more of a parallel to the story and one person is kind of viewed as center stage.
What about with rhetoric?
I didn't know rhetoric, but rhetoric's different because it's kind of using more of a three-step approach to delivering a speech. So using kind of tapping into three different sections of the brain as opposed to comparison to a story.
Yeah, so like ethos, pathos, logos. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that one thing you all do a really good job of pointing out here is that all three of these theories are assuming a certain degree of agency from a speaker or presenter, right? Rhetoric is looking at very public speaker and address, as we saw with Mark Antony example last week. Dramatism is suggesting sort of we are presenting, sharing as part of a stage. A narrative paradigm is assuming us as storytellers who are conveying experience. And we often experience exposure to media, to stories, to experiences that aren't necessarily coming from a single actor. So the focus on a person delivering the message is pretty unique here. But as you brought up, right, rhetoric is focusing on elements like ethos, pathos, logos, on logical appeals, on context and setting. Dramatism is very much focusing on the different things that make up a scene, such as agent, agency, and so on. Narrative paradigm is looking at less about the speaker and the speaker's background, more about the story and how they're choosing to tell that story and using that to weigh its persuasiveness. So rather than looking at sort of the character of the person, it's looking at the character of the story and how that story is being shared. You all in the middle had a good example here of a narrative. What was your narrative example there?
Oh, just the tales you get told when you like come to college, and so we use the example of how North Hall is haunted, and that's true. So don't try to do that on narrative like that, but
Yeah.
but we just use like that, or like kind of like what people like older or above you. We also use the example of like parents saying like, oh, don't turn the car light on, like that's illegal, I'll get pulled over. Like people above you using like a narrative to kind of like put thoughts in your head when you're like in a new space or for something that they don't know.
Yeah. The fish is floating and just is taking a nap, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we'll use stories like that as a means of kind of euphemizing and helping kids, better grapple with difficult situations. Or sometimes it's like hazing, it's, taking first-year students and spooking them a little bit by saying that the hall is haunted, using stories like that. Sometimes it's for fun, sometimes it's a means of parenting. So using stories in that way is a useful application. And how about you all here on the end, coherence or fidelity?
Oh, okay. You say fidelity because you shifted more memorizability, some person tells you that's you know from their knowledge. Because when other person is almost present better way but it's hard to as well. Because it is the fidelity.
So, looking at the groups, most folks seem to be on Team Fidelity, which I understand. And we noticed that as well with Austin's presentation. But one thing is food for thought, especially if you are undecided or on the fence about an issue, is that coherence can be really useful as a tiebreaker, right? For example, if you're an undecided voter and you're looking at two candidates, oftentimes the person who is coming across as more professional, prepared, who has a more coherent point is likely to be more compelling. So fidelity tends to work in sort of reaffirming views that we already have and the stories we incorporate within that. Coherence tends to work a lot better with stories and experiences we have less of a frame of reference for, because we're looking at the overall structure of the story to assess its worth without as much knowledge about its truthfulness. So continue to think about some of these and the ways that these different approaches shape our understanding of issues. So to wrap up for today, we talked about the narrative paradigm, the usage of storytelling in our experiences as shaped by culture, and how we assess storytelling according to this theory. We'll have Kyle and Angel present on Wednesday as we shift gears into media ecology theory. Please pass forward or email your attendance with group member names on it if you haven't done so already. Have a great rest of your morning, and I will see you again for class on Wednesday.
What's up?